Submission. The Byzantine Empire had been fighting the Persian kingdoms for centuries. But in the 7th century, a new force emerged from Arabia, a region that hitherto had been known only for tribal conflict, and camels, and sand. In 610, in a cave near the city of Mecca, a man called Muhammad had a vision. He became a prophet, and over the next 12 years gathered many followers. But he also made enemies, and in 622 he was forced out of Mecca to find refuge in the city of Medina. This was the Hegira, and it marks the beginning of the Muslim era. A lack of humour alert. Readers should note that for obvious reasons there are no jokes in this section. Muhammad was sternly monotheistic. He was familiar with both Jewish and Christian religions, but he believed that both deviated from the true path. He proclaimed one unified faith under the God, Arabic Al-Ilah, later shortened to Allah. This faith was Islam, which means submission. Islam rejected the divinity and resurrection of Jesus, although it recognized both Jesus and Moses as prophets. At the start, Muhammad instructed his followers to pray facing Jerusalem, but after violent conflict with the Jews in Medina, he changed the direction to be towards Mecca. Despite the conflict with Jews, Islam endorsed circumcision and dietary laws, as well as other aspects of Judaism. But Islam also seems to have adapted some of the practices of early Christianity. Ramadan may come from early Christian observance of Lent. Prayer mats and prostrating yourself in prayer were the norm among Christians in the Middle East. In fact, prayer mats were used by Christian monks from Syria to Ireland. You can even see them in the carpet pages of the illuminated Celtic manuscripts. It's even been suggested that the familiar minaret towers of the mosques may have been inspired by the pillars of monks like Simeon. One thing it definitely didn't adopt was early Christian pacifism. Islam was avowedly militaristic. Muhammad himself returned to Mecca with an army and captured the city in in 630. When he died 2 years later, he left behind a large group of well-armed, highly motivated followers. In 634, an Arab army defeated the Byzantine emperor Heraclius. 12 years after Muhammad had fled for his life from Mecca, the whole of Arabia was Muslim. In the decade following, they took all of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Most significantly, in February 638, Jerusalem was captured by Muslim forces after a year's siege. The victorious Caliph, Umar, rode into the city in a dignified way, or as dignified as anyone can be when they are riding a camel. Alone and dressed in the plain robes of a pilgrim, he received the surrender from Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. He refused to enter the Church of the Anastasis, but went to the Temple Mount, which he found in a ruinous state. He subsequently built a mosque on the ruins. In the early 690s, this original building was replaced with what is now known as the Dome of the Rock, a building that bears in the writing on its walls, something over the page, the earliest datable use of the word Muslim. Perhaps the most famous Islamic building in the world, it was actually built by Greek Christian craftsmen from Byzantium. The Arabs of the time were jolly good at tents, but not so hot on intricate octagonal architecture. By the end of the century, Muslim forces had spread west along North Africa to the Atlantic. They even arrived at the walls of Constantinople in 672, but were repulsed. The Greeks used something called Greek fire to destroy the Arab ships, a mix of petrol, sulphur and pitch, fired from a copper tube. It was the 7th century equivalent of napalm. By 711, the Arabs had conquered North Africa and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain. 20 years later, they crossed the Pyrenees into France, where at Poitiers, only 150 miles from Paris, their advance was finally halted by the Frankish ruler, Charles Martel. The effect of all this conquering was devastating for the Church. The North African Church, the Church of Tertullian and Cyprian and Origen and Augustine, was effectively wiped out. Some communities survived by rather devious means. The St. Catherine Monastery below Mount Sinai managed to find a document in its archives in which Muhammad guaranteed protection to the community. He'd even autographed it with a picture of his own hand. Just to make sure, they also built a mosque inside the walls, complete with minaret. It was facing the wrong way, but no one seems to have spotted this. Christians were expelled from Arabia itself. In other regions, Christians and Jews were organised into separate communities, where they were free to practice their religion in private, but they had to pay special taxes, and were allotted second-class status. 3 of the 5 historic centres of the Church, Alexandria, Antioch and Jerusalem, had fallen. The historic homelands of Christianity, its countries of origin, were lost to Christianity. such Christians as remained had to live with the reality that they were no longer in charge. And, barring a brief few decades, they have remained no longer in charge ever since. I missed out a footnote there somewhere. Maybe. It's not important.